Remains of Solomon's Temple, the Holy of Holies, and the tops of some of Solomon's original Temple Mount walls are still visible in Jerusalem today. If you've been there, you likely walked right past them, or maybe you've seen them in pictures and not known what you were seeing. But understanding the original biblical and historical records brings these remains into sharp focus, and what you ignored becomes the definitive evidence for the exact location of the temple, the Holy of Holies, and the original Temple Mount. That's what we're talking about and showing you today. And we're starting right now. Wait a minute, you're probably saying. Jesus told us not one stone would be left upon another. And that's true. And in every one of these cases, not one stone is upon another. But in order to find these things, you have to know where to look. And Solomon's temple location is quite elusive. It is probably the greatest quest in the history of mankind. Many have suggested ideas that the temple was located to the south of the Dome of the Rock. Some have suggested to the north of the Dome of the Rock, and some right over the rock in the Dome of the Rock. And many more, especially in America, have suggested that the temple was set up in the city of David off the Temple Mount entirely. I'm just like you. I thought I knew the answer, as did my friend, a friend of his channel, Fisherman. Both of us thought we knew, but both of us changed our minds just in the last year after discovering some evidence that has been ignored by most, including us. If this evidence is that convincing that it changed the minds of both Fisherman and myself, I think you deserve to see and decide for yourself. Now, this evidence isn't new. It was published in the magazine Biblical Archaeological Review, commonly called BAR, back in the 1990s. Yeah, like way back in the 90s. But in America, it has been ignored. And that is why we're doing this video today. The scholar who has shed more light on this subject than anyone else in the world is Dr. Lean Rittmeyer, who is actually a trained architect, which is a skill set that sets him apart from other archaeologists working on the mystery of the location of the temple. Now, Rittmeyer is a believer in Messiah Jesus, and despite that, he has totally convinced the Jewish Sanhedrin, the Temple Institute, and the Jewish authorities that he has located the spot where Solomon's temple was located and the exact spots where the Ark of the Covenant and the brazen altar used to be. Pretty amazing stuff. That is important, very important. If the Jewish authorities believe Rittmeyer is correct, they are going to do sacrifices on that spot, build any temple structures on that spot, etc. Let's say that again. Where the Jews believe the right spot is where they're going to perform their sacrifices, build structures, and in general, it's where all the action is going to take place. Now, personally, I used to believe that Solomon's temple was in the city of David, south of a Temple Mount, and that the Temple Mount was the Antonian fortress. Many of our viewers currently are convinced of the very same thing. I read books like Ernest Martin's The Temples, Jerusalem for God, and Bob Cornick's The Temple. I even did my own video on this topic in 2019, so for me to change my mind is a pretty big deal. So I know all the verses that these books use to support a City of David temple, like Jesus' statement that not one stone will be left on another, and Psalm's reference that all my springs are in you. We'll discuss both of these verses later in this video, so stay tuned. In 1983, Asher Kaufman, who was a professor at Hebrew University, suggested the temple was located to the north of the Dome of the Rock, over an area today called the Dome of the Spirits, a small cupola 300 feet north of the dome. This is where Fisherman believed it was. But he has changed his mind also. So what is this evidence that could make both of us change our minds about the most important real estate on the planet? Now, if we look at 1 Kings, we see that Solomon took the ark out of the city of David to the temple. So one might ask, why are we even discussing this? It seems to clearly state that the temple wasn't in the city of David. But we've got to look at the rest of the evidence because it is fascinating. Now, back in March, April 1992, in a landmark BAR article, Lean Rittmeyer showed how the Jewish rabbinical teaching, the Mishnah, taught that Solomon's temple was built on a 500 cubits square. Rittmeyer then located this 500 cubit square on the Temple Mount, the yellow square, from known landmarks, causing a stir that hasn't settled down since. This is revolutionary thinking to many. This 500 cubit square was the original Temple Mount, Solomon's Temple Mount, and frankly, the only portion of the present Temple Mount that most Orthodox Jews consider holy. It was later expanded by the Hasmonean kings after the revolt of the Maccabees, the orange section, and then greatly expanded by King Herod, the green section. So the Temple Mount today isn't the Temple Mount that Solomon built. It wasn't a single construction, but it was built in multiple layers. Let's stop and think what that means. Many believe the Temple Mount today is the remains of the Antonia fortress, not the Temple Mount at all. Does this make any sense? Now we know that it was built in multiple layers and levels of construction. No, it makes no sense. It only makes sense if it's the Temple Mount. Now let's return to the original 500 cubit square. In fact, only the eastern wall remains somewhat intact from the 500 cubit square. The northern, southern, and western walls were all built by Herod, not Solomon. This is a key understanding. The western Wailing Wall that the Jews view as holy today wasn't part of the original Temple Mount. Think about that. The Wailing Wall isn't part of Solomon's true Temple Mount. Now Solomon decided to build the temple at the top of Mount Moriah, on the same land his father King David bought from Ornan the Jebusite. The threshing floor, you've probably heard of that. But this top of Mount Moriah was very uneven. This picture is Rittmeyer's topographical map of Mount Moriah prior to the temple's construction. So Solomon created retaining walls in the shape of a square and backfilled it in with dirt to make a flat platform. Josephus, the famous first-century Jewish historian, reinforces this is what happened in his Wars of the Jews, chapter 5. At first, the plain at the top was hardly sufficient for the holy house and the altar, for the ground about it was very uneven and like a precipice. But when King Solomon, who was the person that built the temple, had built a wall on his east side, and then when they built walls on the three sides, the temple round about from the bottom of the hill. Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, wrote about the size of this square as well. This hill was walled all around, encompasses of 4 furlongs, the distance of each angle containing in length a furlong. Now a furlong was about 500 cubits in length. And this square wasn't just any square. Its walls were exactly aligned with the 4 cardinal points of the compass. The eastern wall is still aligned within 3 degrees of true north. Pretty amazing for something 3,000 years old. The same is true for all the other original walls. But notice something interesting. the foundation rock, which is supposed to be the location of the Holy of Holies, was not located in the exact center of Solomon's original Temple Mount. It was in the northwest corner. Solomon chose this site because it was the topographical high point, as you can see. And this matches the historic Jewish records as well. According to another ancient Mishnah statement, the Temple Mount was 500 cubits by 500 cubits, but its largest open space was the courtyard to the south, the second largest toward the east, the third largest toward the north, and the least toward the west. And that places the Holy of Holies of the temple exactly on the rock under the dome of the rock. Now, these references to the Mishnah are the reason that so many seeking the temple location have missed it, because they don't know these exclusively Jewish historical references. But Rittmeyer did. However, unfortunately, Bob Cornick, the author of the temple, did not include any. To my understanding, there are no Mishnah quotes in his book about the temple being in the city of David. If he had realized that the original Temple Mount was a 500 cubit square, he would have recognized that it wouldn't fit on the narrow spar of land that is the city of David. Just looking at this map of Jerusalem in 63 AD shows that moving the Temple Mount onto the city of David is absolutely impossible. But let's return to our examination of the true Temple Mount. As we mentioned, after the Maccabean revolt, the Hasmonean kings of Israel expanded the walls to the south, as we see in this illustration. But notice, the Hasmonean section bends slightly. It doesn't run as perfectly north-south as the original eastern wall. And starting in 19 BC, King Herod began his grand expansion of the temple, and his walls are pictured here. The fact the temple wasn't exactly centered, and when we mentioned that before, really irritated King Herod, who was a perfectionist. So as you can see, Herod rebuilt the Temple Mount so the temple was centered within his newly constructed walls. These historic records are like a fingerprint. If there's a 500 cubit square walls on the Temple Mount, we're going to have a match, an almost undeniable match. And this is what Rittmeyer believed as well. So he began measuring the eastern wall, starting just north of the eastern gate, where some Phoenician stones stop and Herodian stones begin. Now Solomon used Phoenician stonemasons, and Rittmeyer concluded that these few Phoenician stones were the remains of the northeast corner of Solomon's eastern wall. He started there and continued south along the eastern wall and found that exactly 500 cubits down the wall bends. That's the place where the Hasmoneans increased the length of the wall, but did so not to the same exact north to south measurement that Solomon used. That's why the wall bends. The three layers of construction here should reinforce that the Temple Mount was not the Antonia fortress that was built all at one time by the Hasmonean kings, according to Josephus. Also, the Hasmoneans, as you saw, were not as precise as Solomon, so that's why the wall bends at that point. The Hasmoneans weren't aligned to true north like Solomon was. This marked out the southeast corner of the original 500 cubit square. Rittmeyer then began to look for the western wall. Now remember, this isn't the western wall today. That's Herod's wall. Solomon's western retaining wall was inside of Herod's. So Rittmeyer paced off 500 cubits. At the northwestern corner of the Dome of the Rock's platform, there is a staircase, a very special staircase. And the bottom step of that staircase goes in a different direction than the rest of the steps on that staircase, and it's made of different stone than the rest of the stairs. This stair happens to parallel perfectly the eastern wall. It's a perfect within 3 degrees of a north-south wall. Rittmeyer realized it had to be part of Solomon's original wall, and that likely the Muslims who built the stairs up to the Dome of the Rock simply used the top of Solomon's old wall as their first stair. Our friend Fisherman saw this stair on one of his trips to Israel and wondered out loud why it was different than all the other stairs. And this is the reason. It happens to be the top of one of Solomon's walls. That square with the eastern and western walls identified marks out the perfect 500 cubits Temple Mount of Solomon. What's even more conclusive is the position of the Holy of Holies within it. Rittmeyer believed the holiest spot on earth is centered around the rock that the Dome of the Rock protects. Now, in the 4th century, a pilgrim from Bordeaux, France, went to Jerusalem, and in the record of his trip, he describes, quote, a perforated stone to which the Jews come every year and anoint it, bewail themselves with groans, rend their garments, and so depart. So Jews have favored this foundation stone as the site of the Holy of Holies since at least that time, which was 330 AD. And here's where it gets even more exciting. On the rock, there is a rectangular cut neatly into the rock that is exactly the width and length of the Ark of the Covenant, 2.5 by 1.5 cubits. Not only is this cutout area the exact size of the Ark of the Covenant, but it is in the exact center of the area Rittmeyer believes was the Holy of Holies. That the Holy of Holies is enclosed in 3 sides by hash marks in the illustration. Now, Rittmeyer noted this area to the south. It's about 10 feet wide, or 6 cubits according to the biblical rendering, and that would be the perfect place for the south wall of the Holy of Holies. And this area, along the western side, you can see a balustrade or wooden fence built by the Muslims that corresponds perfectly to where the western wall would be inside the Holy of Holies. And then, where this balustrade goes along the northern side of the wall, it conforms perfectly with the northern wall of the Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple. What if you found out the cutout area and Rittmeyer's proposed walls are also perfectly aligned with the 4 cardinal points of the compass, at least within 3.5 degrees of true north? This simply can't be a coincidence. It's laid out exactly parallel to the walls of the 500 cubit square Temple Mount that Rittmeyer discovered previously. But what's interesting and totally unexpected, at least to me, is that the rectangular depression for the ark runs east to west rather than north-south. Meaning that when you look at the Ark of the Covenant with the curtains drawn, you would have seen the short end of the ark, not the broad side of it, which is usually what's pictured. Why was that? With the short side facing the veil, when the priest would enter, he would have to come around to the side in order to sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. And we have a scripture in the 8th chapter of 1 Kings that's very interesting about this point. The priests brought the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to its place, into the inner sanctuary of the house, its most holy place, under the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark, and the cherubim made a covering over the ark and its poles from above. But the poles were so long that the ends of the poles could be seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary. Now, the only way that the poles would stick out into the next room, the holy place, is if the ark was situated lengthwise, as we just showed you, with the short aspect facing the other room, the holy place. And this makes sense. You couldn't have taken the poles out of the ark if it faced sideways. It had to be lengthwise to be able to remove the poles. We read verse 6 of 1 Kings 8, and it said that they brought the ark into its place. Now, as you look at the original language of this text, it's talking about a place that was prepared for the ark, and it implies a manufactured spot. Rittmeyer has suggested that there had to have been a hewn-out spot for the ark so it wouldn't wobble. I mean, the rock under the dome of the rock is incredibly uneven. It was the most important object on earth, after all, so what we see on the foundation stone matches the historic and biblical record perfectly. The Temple Mount also aligns with the golden or eastern gate. Ezekiel 44:1-2 describes this gate in the end times. We're going to do another video on this topic in the future. The Temple Mount and the resting place of the Ark of the Covenant on the foundation stone also aligns with the Mount of Olives and the spot where the red heifer was sacrificed. During that sacrifice of the heifer, the priest would sprinkle blood in the direction of the temple and be able to look right down into the Holy of Holies. Now, how did he do this? If the eastern gate doesn't exactly align with the temple location, because it doesn't. This is the view from the Mount of Olives. Notice, from this point, you can look right over the wall, and if the dome of the rock wasn't there, you could probably see the foundation stone. In temple days, if the Nicanor gate within the temple complex was open, and the temple was open, you could look right into the Holy of Holies when the red heifer was sacrificed. All these things were carefully laid out by Solomon, and it has not shifted in 3,000 years. All these angular relationships are still in existence the way they were in Solomon's day. The evidence is on the ground and overwhelming. The only reason anyone contests it is 2 verses from the biblical record. In Matthew 24, we read, Jesus came out from the temple and was going away, when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said, "Do you not see these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone will here be left upon another, which will not be torn down." This is the verse that hangs almost everyone up about the Temple Mount being the former Temple Mount. But you know, this wasn't the only time Jesus referred to no stone being left on another. Prior to entering Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, he wept over Jerusalem and made a very similar remark. "Your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." But notice, this was about all of Jerusalem. At this time, Jesus was weeping for Jerusalem. It was not just about the temple or the temple buildings. And yet, the western wall still stands. Was Jesus wrong? Because obviously not every stone in Jerusalem was cast down. No, because what Jesus spoke is a Jewish idiom. Saying no stone was left on another was a way of saying total destruction. It wasn't a literal statement. Not every stone had to be cast down. Second, as we mentioned before, the Western Wall was built by Herod. It is not even part of the original Temple Mount. Jews at that time did not consider anything outside the 500 cubit square to be holy. It could have been that in Matthew 24, Jesus was only referring to the original square, and this makes sense. Because the disciples asked about the temple buildings. They were pointing out the temple buildings to Jesus. And Jesus said of those, not one stone would be left on another. And third, in Matthew 24, Jesus was referring to the Old Testament, as he did so frequently. From this day onward, before one stone was placed on another in the temple of the Lord. And that's from Haggai. This phrase was specifically speaking of the rebuilding of a temple in the days of Haggai the prophet. So it is only the temple stones that Jesus was likely speaking of. It was sort of the reversal of the rebuilding after the return from Babylon. In our Western society, we look at this phrase, one stone upon another, and think it is a generalized phrase, any old stone. But by quoting Haggai, Jesus was speaking only of the temple and the temple buildings. Well, okay, you might say. Maybe one stone on another has a meaning we hadn't considered before. Yeah, but what about Psalm 87? The Lord will count when he registers the people. This one was born there, Selah. Then those who sing, as well as those who play flutes, and that was something happening in the temple, shall say, all my springs are in you. Those who quote this verse contest that the only spring in Jerusalem is the Gihon spring in the city of David. There are no springs on or under the Temple Mount. But the phrase, all my springs are in you, is very strange, seemingly out of place. First of all, there's only one spring, the Gihon. So why is it all my springs? Second, you are probably unaware of this, but this verse can be interpreted two ways, depending on where the vowels are placed in Hebrew, and you know in the original text there were no vowel points. That's something that came 1,000 years after Christ. Now, the first way of translating this verse is, all my springs are in you, which we already said is a little strange. The second is, my eyes are always on you, which frankly makes so much more sense. This is almost a direct quote of Deuteronomy 11:12. So is this another example of a mistranslated verse? Well, perhaps. It certainly isn't the kind of verse we should base an entire doctrine of where the temple is located on, is it? So hopefully you see that these verses that seem to support the temple being in the city of David do no such thing, and weighed against the overwhelming evidence on the ground in support of a Temple Mount location, well, that seems to settle the matter. But what about all the temple instruments, the treasures of Solomon's temple? Is it possible they have been hidden and are awaiting use in the end times? It seems they have been. To keep watching, click right here and learn why Israel knows where they are, yet refuses to dig them up. And you might ask, hey, wait a minute, we're getting off the subject too soon. What about the Antonia Fortress? Isn't the Temple Mount the Antonia? If you want to see that video, click right here. Either way, till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.